A 7-year-old girl, marked with bruises, walked into an emergency room carrying her baby brother. Her frame was small and unsteady, yet her arms held him with a grip that didn't waver. Before we dive into the story, tell us where you're watching from. She hadn't come seeking attention for herself. Even in silence, the weight of her mission was unmistakable, keeping the baby safe. What she would eventually say to the staff revealed a kind of responsibility no child her age should know. And it all began the moment those hospital doors opened. The automatic doors slid back and a girl stood framed in the sterile hospital light. Alone. Small and silent, her outline seemed swallowed by the wide lobby's sharp angles and white glare. For a moment, she looked less like a patient and more like a shadow that had wandered in. No one noticed at first. Charts clicked against keyboards, printers hummed, and staff voices carried in steady conversation. She stepped forward anyway, her shoes barely whispering on the polished floor. The baby in her arms stirred, and she shifted her grip without hesitation, never glancing down. Her eyes swept the room in deliberate movements. Reception desk, waiting chairs, open hallways. Not curious. Not wandering, measuring. She carried the weight carefully, a bruise spreading purple under fluorescent lights. Impossible to miss once you finally looked at her. But she offered no words and drew no sound beyond the faint rustle of cloth against her arms. Even her brother remained quiet, tucked against her ribs, his head cradled in her palm. Stillness held her like armor. Emergency rooms are usually full of coughs, shuffling shoes, muted voices breaking the weight. Here there was only her silence. Shoulders locked into effort, but no complaint slipped out. It was the stillness itself that made the air uneasy. A chair screeched softly against the floor as one nurse finally lifted her eyes. The sight stopped her. Frown. Double take. Papers set aside. Concern flickered across her face before she moved, quick but steady. She rounded the counter, careful not to startle, her voice softening into something even and practiced for a child's ear. Kneeling to meet her eyes, the nurse tried to close the distance in small, cautious motions. Around them, the rhythm of the room shifted. One by one, staff glanced up, attention drawn not by noise, but by the sudden hush. Monitors blinked, computers sat idle, as the focus narrowed to the pair just inside those glass doors. The girl stood, holding her brother, steady and silent. She waited, and when she finally spoke, everything shifted. Her grip on the baby defined the moment. His small body rested against her side, wrapped in a thin blanket that did little against the cool hospital air. One sock was gone, leaving a pale foot exposed against her sleeve. She kept one hand cupped at the back of his head, the other braced beneath him, steady despite the quiet strain in her posture. Her shoulders tightened with the effort, though she never let it show on her face. Each small shift revealed hints of fatigue. An arm trembled briefly when she adjusted the blanket. A quick roll of her shoulder gave away the weight she carried. Yet her hold never slipped. She moved with the kind of precision that comes only from habit, every adjustment small and careful, avoiding any motion that might unsettle him. When the baby made a soft sound, she rocked him gently without even looking down. The movement was instinctive, a rhythm drawn from repetition. Her focus stayed outward, scanning the adults around them. Each step from the staff, each rustle of paper or squeak of a shoe, pulled at her attention. She turned her body in slight angles, always keeping herself between her brother and those approaching hands. He stayed calm in her arms, his face tilted upward toward hers with quiet trust. No tears, no fussing, just wide eyes tracking the only figure he seemed to recognize as safe. It was a wordless exchange, his stillness depending on her steady presence. She gave him every cue of safety without speaking a word. The nurse, watching closely, began to see the strain creeping through the little girl's endurance. Her right arm lingered stiff, refusing to carry more weight. The other did the work, pulled tighter with each adjustment. It wasn't a plea for help, but the signs were there if you knew to look. That was when the nurse caught something else, details that went beyond posture, beyond the weight she carried, details that marked the child herself. A nurse finally noticed. The nurse's gaze shifted as more of the girl came into view. The marks on her skin were hard to ignore. Yellow fading into green, deep purple still fresh. Some looked older, some new. The change in the nurse's face said more than words. A quiet recognition that this was not the story of a single fall on a playground. A small scar traced near her hairline, hard to notice until she turned her head. The cuffs of her sweater hung loose with fraying threads, fabric thinned and stretched by long use. These details added to the quiet picture in front of them, signs of wear that matched the child's guarded way of standing. Her eyes stayed steady, but they watched hands more than faces. Every gesture near her drew a subtle flinch or a quick blink before she froze herself back into stillness. When the nurse reached forward to adjust the baby's blanket, the girl's body stiffened. She tried to mask it, smoothing her face into something neutral, but the reflex had already shown. It was a kind of alertness not usually seen at her age. Each step closer from an adult brought a measured adjustment from her, small angles of her body turning protectively. She kept the most bruised side slightly angled away, while shifting her brother closer to her chest. Even while standing in front of help, she held on to him like a shield. The nurse slowed her own movements in response. She kept her tone calm, her words even. Training guided her now. Notice, then document. Ask carefully, but gently. Every observation mattered. The pattern of marks, the way the child shielded herself, the contrast between the girl's tension and the infant's calm in her arms. The baby's breathing stayed soft and even. His head rested trustingly against her shoulder, while her eyes flicked to every sound, every motion. She carried the burden and the watchfulness both. The nurse waited before asking anything more. Something in the silence held weight, as if the girl was saving her breath for the words that mattered. Those words, when they finally came, would change the room entirely. She hadn't spoken at all until now, holding on to her silence as tightly as she held her brother. The nurse had crouched lower, her voice gentle, asking if the girl herself was hurt. The words were careful, softened at the edges, meant to sound safe in a place that often felt overwhelming. She didn't press closer, leaving room for the child to decide whether to answer. The girl moved at last. She shook her head, firm, deliberate, not frightened. Her eyes never broke from the nurse's face, searching for some sign of how her refusal would be received. The baby stirred against her chest, and she adjusted without looking down, arms still steady, gaze still fixed. When her voice finally came, it was smaller than her frame, but clear enough to cut through the busy room. All other sounds faded as the words stretched between them, direct and impossible to miss. "Please check my brother first," she said, her eyes locked on the nurse. "I'm okay, but he's too little to tell you where it hurts." The sentence was brief, but every person present seemed to feel its weight. She hadn't spoken about her own bruises, or asked for food or comfort. She hadn't even hinted at the effort it took to keep holding him. Instead, every syllable carried adult responsibility in a child's voice. The nurse nodded solemnly, the gesture quiet but unmistakable. Around her, staff stilled in recognition of what had just been asked. Their work no longer felt like ordinary triage. From that point, the team's attention widened. Not just treatment, but protection. Not just injuries, but the children themselves and the bond between them. The nurse signaled for additional support. Others moved with new purpose, their pace adjusting from routine to something more careful, more deliberate. Through it all, the girl stayed watchful, her body still angled between her brother and the unfamiliar adults who stepped closer. She never let her guard drop, even when help gathered at her side. And as the medical team began their quiet work, another truth surfaced. She seemed to know far more about her baby brother's needs than any sister her age should. How long had she been carrying this weight alone? As the staff worked quietly, their movements slowed and deliberate, they noticed how closely she tracked each step. Her eyes followed every draw of a curtain, each gloved hand adjusting her brother's blanket, every tool lifted toward him. Nothing slipped past her attention. When the nurses asked about his needs, she answered with unnerving specificity. Feeding times came out as precise hours, not guesses. She described his faint fuss if a certain blanket felt too scratchy, how he settled more quickly when rocked in one steady rhythm instead of a bounce. The clarity of her responses made the team pause. To the medical team, her answers suggested this wasn't just occasional babysitting. She spoke with the ease of someone who had lived these routines day after day. Short replies, but exacting. Quick, confident, and certain. The kind of detail that doesn't come from watching, but from doing. One nurse asked, gently, how long she had been looking after him like this. The girl's answer stretched back, not to last week, not to yesterday, but further. Her words described habits formed over months, not days, enough time for her brother's recurring patterns to become etched into her memory. To the staff, it began to look less like she filled in for someone else, and more like she had been the constant. What stood out most was the contrast between her knowledge of him and the vagueness of her answers about herself. She struggled to recall when she had last eaten a full meal, or when someone checked her own bruises. Her certainty faded the moment the focus turned from her brother's body to her own. That gap deepened the picture staff were assembling. Her world revolved around his care, while her own needs blurred into the background. Through it all, she stayed in position as his shield. Even while talking, her body angled forward, intercepting hands before they reached him, measuring each adult by how near they moved. The staff recognized it and adjusted in kind. They worked with her presence instead of against it, respectful, calm, explaining every step so she knew exactly what was happening to him. And as the night carried on, that respect would matter even more, because soon, the one holding everything together would finally reach her breaking point. The social worker arrived and lowered herself to the child's level, her tone steady and soft. Questions came in small pieces, not rushed, giving the girl room to decide how much to share. The staff around them stepped back a little, creating space where the conversation could unfold without interruption. It was when the simple question came, "What made you come tonight?" that the girl's composure broke. Her shoulders began to quiver. She stared at her brother, then at the floor. Slowly, haltingly, her words began to form. She spoke of shouting that had grown sharper, of objects breaking too close for comfort. The places she once relied on to hide no longer felt safe enough. Her decision to walk through those hospital doors wasn't sudden. She had been waiting, watching. She knew which spaces kept them hidden until they didn't anymore. She understood the rhythms of danger in the house, and she chose a time when leaving seemed less likely to be noticed. It was a kind of planning most adults would recognize, but it came from a child's need to protect someone smaller. She carried her brother down streets she already knew by memory. The route wasn't guessed, it was practiced. She could point out each landmark that brought them closer. This was not panic, it was purpose. She had tried other ways before, but those ways had stopped working. Walking to the hospital became the path she trusted most. As she explained, the picture sharpened. What she described helped staff understand just how unsafe the home could be. Her vocabulary included small phrases no child should be fluent in, tones of warning, signs of threat, the difference between when to freeze and when to move. These weren't overheard lessons. They were survival rules. Through it all, she never once mentioned herself first. Every detail circled back to her brother. She spoke as though her own bruises didn't matter compared to what might happen to him if she stayed silent one more night. The staff listened, careful not to rush her, and with each word, one truth became clear. She had tried everything she knew to keep him safe. Tonight was the night she ran out of options. Hospital staff moved quickly to ensure both children were safe and connected with people who could help. In the hours that followed, the girl's guard began to ease. The tension in her shoulders softened, if only slightly, and she allowed others to tend to her while keeping one steady hand near her brother. Her simple request, putting him first, reshaped the night. What began as a silent entrance became a moment that rallied adults to act with care and urgency. Before we share the next story, tell us in the comments if you've ever seen unexpected courage in someone young. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.